a new generation of potential revolutionaries is growing up in a period of political reaction. I grew up during the McCarthy period and know how demoralizing that period was. The difference in that period from today was that the Soviet Union was a powerful workers' state, and China's revolution and Cuba's revolution gave one the feeling that a communist revolution was just around the corner. The new generation has not experienced the optimism that carried us through that difficult period. The revolutionary period of the last century has ended. As a result, our older generation has the responsibility to inspire the new generation of potential revolutionaries to learn from our experiences, both positive and negative. They need to study and learn from our experiences in order to prepare them for the coming revolutionary period that is ahead of us. The tragic events arising from the overthrow of the Soviet Union must be studied and the lessons learned. Revolutionaries all over the world must try to understand both the triumphs and the tragic events of the last century of the struggle for socialism. Idealizing the Soviet Union serves no purpose. Marxism is a science. In order for scientists to learn from an experiment, one must examine all the failures even more than the successes. The Soviet Union was an experiment in worker rule. If you examine the history of the Soviet Union with rose-colored glasses, then you are only fooling yourself. I have often quoted Mao's statement that in a critical battle, he did not want to put a commander in charge who has never lost a battle, because that commander would not know what can go wrong. Today, we are at the point of transition from the end of the previous revolutionary period and inevitably the birth of a new revolutionary period. We need to understand and learn from the past in order to understand how to go forward. It is apparent that similar problems face our class on a worldwide scale today, as were faced by Marxist revolutionaries more than a century ago at the beginning of that previous revolutionary period. What's our most serious problem for communists today? It's ideology. There is a misleading belief in many, not all, held by just some, but it's a problem, that the most developed capitalist countries, such as the US, imperialist monster, are the least likely countries to have a communist revolution. This is completely false, and an examination of the history of the last century will show that. While a vigorous anti-imperialist movement is an important element in a revolutionary struggle, it also has the negative effect of creating the mistaken belief that the real revolutionary action must take place in the most oppressed countries, not here in the belly of the beast. The greatest class contradictions between workers and the capitalists are right here at home in the US, because there is no intermediary mass peasantry. Here, the worker faces the oligarch, who oppresses all of us directly, face to face. Is it not true that World War I and World War II were fought amongst the most developed capitalist countries, and that the entire period, and that entire period, was the era of the fiercest revolutionary struggles in those same highly developed capitalist countries. To show you how little things have changed, here's a quote from page 5 of Trotsky's book, The Third International After Lenin, that was written in 1928. Quote, "It is precisely the international strength of the United States and her irresistible expansion arising from it that compels her to include the powder magazines of the whole world into the foundations of her own structure. That is, all the antagonisms between the East and the West, the class struggle of old Europe, the uprisings of the colonial masses, and all wars and revolutions. On the one hand, this transformed North American capitalism into the basic counter-revolutionary force of the modern epoch, constantly more interested in the maintenance of order in every corner of the terrestrial globe. And on the other hand, this prepares the ground for a gigantic revolutionary explosion in the already dominant and still expanding world imperialist power." That quote from 1928 describing the U.S. could have been written today, word for word. Has anything changed? For those of you who are squeamish about quotes from Trotsky, here's a quote from Lenin in 1916, from the Junius pamphlet, page 31. Quote, "The struggle of the oppressed nations in Europe, a struggle capable of going all the way to insurrection and street fighting, capable of breaking down the iron discipline of the army and martial law, will sharpen the revolutionary crisis in Europe to an infinitely greater degree than a much more developed rebellion in a remote colony. A blow delivered against the power of the English imperialist bourgeoisie by a rebellion in Ireland is 100 times more significant politically than a blow of equal force delivered in Asia or Africa. Today, you can substitute Ukraine for Ireland and U.S. imperialist bourgeoisie for the English imperialist bourgeoisie and get the same meaning. Isn't the breaking down of the iron discipline of the army what happened in the U.S. during the Vietnam War? The nationally oppressed people of color, led by the black community, rebelled against the war and against racist oppression in almost every city across the U.S. And those who were drafted into the military destroyed the iron discipline of the U.S. imperialist military, forcing the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam. At that time, most white workers in the U.S. and the unions that they led went along with the U.S. imperialist war in Vietnam. Today, that is no longer the case. At that time, there existed a large section of white workers who believed that they benefited from U.S. imperialism. The high-tech revolution has gone a long ways towards changing all that, with millions of white workers' living standards being steadily driven downwards over the last 3+ decades. In addition, the cities in the U.S. have for the most part become majority people of color and immigrant. Even the biggest state, California, is becoming majority Mexican. The racist irony of bigoted white Californians demonstrating against immigrant children in a town, Murrieta, named by Mexicans, in a state with a majority of Mexicans, is completely lost on the racists, but the meaning is not lost on us. These racists are in for a big surprise when they realize just how isolated they are. Likewise, the example of Detroit here in the U.S. is there for all the workers of the world to see. How is Detroit's situation different from that of Greece? The banks are parasites, sucking both Detroit and Greece dry. That sucking sound is going all around Europe, and that parasitic sucking sound can be heard in every city in the U.S. as public services are being wiped out in order to pay the banks for their usurious loans. What is happening in Detroit is coming to you next. But the problem for the ruling class is that almost every city in the U.S. has become majority people of color and immigrant. Even rural areas are changing social composition, although it's not as fast as in the cities. And the cities are the engines of progress and of change, and, of course, of revolution. The Black and Latino rebellions of the 1960s were in cities that were majority white and racist. But the population of the U.S. is fundamentally different from that of the 1960s. And even the white working class is now having its living standards being driven down. A rebellion such as occurred in the 1960s, therefore, will have greater possibilities of unity and success. As a result of this change in the composition of the population of the U.S., both urban and rural, there is a far greater possibility of unity within the U.S. working class versus the capitalist oligarchs than has ever existed previously in this country. Today, the constantly shrinking workers' pay is being stolen by the oligarchs to support their ruling class wars all over the world. And the workers are beginning to understand this fact. The parasitic U.S. ruling class is draining its own economy in order to fund those wars. $3 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan alone, thereby creating the possibility of a giant revolutionary explosion inside the belly of the U.S. imperialist beast. The oligarchs' response to this problem that they face, and that they themselves have created, this monster that's going to overthrow them from within their belly of the beast, is to subject the U.S. workers to the greatest brainwashing propaganda machine that the world has ever seen. The oligarchs are desperately trying to make the U.S. workers believe that they are the most privileged workers on the planet, exactly at the same moment that they are driving those same workers' living standards down further and further. That can't work forever. That propaganda won't fly forever. There is a silver lining to all this, because once the U.S. workers come to an understanding of our victimization, our opponent ruling class will be close at hand. That's an advantage that the neo-colonial peoples around the globe do not have. Unfortunately, this misconception about the lack of revolutionary opportunity right here in the imperialist belly of the beast, for most part, arises from the political mistakes of our own communist movement in the last century, during the last revolutionary period. When we look at what actually took place in the past, almost every revolutionary opportunity prior to and immediately after World War II arose in Europe, not in the colonial world. China in the 1920s was the main exception. During that entire period, Europe was the center and the cauldron of revolution. It was Russia in 1917. Germany from 1919 to 1923, on the brink of revolution for the whole period. Italy after World War I, and again during and after World War II. Spain during the 1930s. France during and after World War II. Yugoslavia and Albania during and after World War II. Greece during and after World War II. And even, to a lesser extent, but even they had their revolutionary moment, Great Britain in 1926. Unfortunately, the historic tragedy of these European revolutionary events was that they all fell victim to an outside force, to the needs of the conservative Soviet bureaucracy and its reactionary theory of socialism in one country. The final nail in the coffin for that revolutionary period was the signing of the Yalta Agreement in 1945, which dealt a death blow to the victory of the European Revolution that was taking place at the end of World War II, clear across the continent. One cannot overemphasize the tragedy for the entire world's working class that the Yalta Agreement represented. The signature by Stalin on that agreement represents one of the greatest betrayals of the workers' struggle for liberation. Yet today, those who call themselves Stalinists cannot be held responsible for that betrayal. Today's Stalinists, for the most part, are revolutionary communists who have a completely understandable misunderstanding of what took place in the past. The communist movement must get beyond our misunderstood labels. The comrades who call themselves Trotskyists or Stalinists or Maoists at this moment in history, for the most part, are all seeking the same end, the overthrow of capitalist rule. None of these political parties or groups or individuals are today beholden to a conservative Soviet bureaucracy that no longer exists. Misconceptions about the past abound in all these parties and groupings, whether they be Trotskyists, Maoists, Stalinists, or whatever. The beginnings of reaching out to each other from all these tendencies, regardless of the label Trotskyists or Stalinists or Maoists, is starting to take place. That's healthy. And we must encourage this beginning of reaching out to each other. And then we must go further towards real unity in action and organization in order to successfully fight against the most powerful imperialist ruling class in human history. Lenin's most referred to document is entitled, "What is to be Done?" Yet, in my opinion, it is possibly the most misunderstood document Lenin ever wrote. Misunderstood, in my opinion, by all these sectarian parties and groupings who constantly refer to it as their basic party building instruction guide, yet they act almost exactly in the opposite direction to Lenin's very message in that document. What is to be done? His pamphlet is an appeal for creating a united nationwide party. It was an appeal to do away with the separated existence of all these local groupings by combining them into one united activist organization led by an elected central committee that would publish a national newspaper that would coordinate the work of all these separate local groups. Unfortunately, most of our current parties and groups are more akin to religious sects than communist organizations. Sects are for the pure. Sects. And it comes from the religious sects. That's where we get the word from. Sects are for the purists and the dogmatists. And unfortunately, so has been the past history of the communist movement after the death of Lenin. Lenin wrote in the following in chapter 1, page 7 of What is to be Done, in opposition to the dogmatists. Quote, only those who are not sure of themselves can fear to enter into temporary alliances even with unreliable people. Not a single political party could exist without such alliances, unquote. If Lenin could justify alliances with unreliable people, cannot we unify with our brother and sister communist revolutionaries, regardless of whether they call themselves Trotskyists, Stalinists, or Maoists? Are we members of a religious order, constantly referring to our holy books, expelling all those who blaspheme our particular god or icon? Or are we communist materialists working in the real world that exists today? Purity is for a religious order, not for communist revolutionary. Does this mean that ideological disputes and even ideological battles should be avoided at all costs? Of course not. These ideological debates are necessary in order to clarify and understand how to go forward. However, these ideological debates cannot be allowed to cripple unity and ultimately cripple a united party. How to allow for this ideological discussion and debate while maintaining unity is critical for the success of our revolutionary struggle. The practical day-to-day struggle must not be counterposed to this ideological training and ideological debate. The two must go hand in hand and must be done simultaneously. Here's another quote from Lenin's What is to be Done. Quote, and it's a famous quote, of course, and you'll recognize it. Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. This idea cannot be insisted upon too strongly at a time when the fashionable preaching of opportunism goes hand in hand with an infatuation for the narrowest forms of practical activity. What at first sight appears to be an unimportant error may lead to the most deplorable consequences. And only short-sighted people can consider factional disputes and a strict differentiation between shades of opinion inopportune or superfluous. The fate of Russian social democracy for very many years to come may depend on the strengthening of one or the other shade. Lenin then goes on to state, quote, the German workers have two important advantages over those of the rest of Europe. First, they belong to the most theoretical people of Europe, and they have retained that sense of theory which the so-called educated classes of Germany have almost completely lost. Without German philosophy, German scientific socialism would never have come into being. Without a sense of theory amongst the workers, this scientific socialism would never have entered their flesh and blood. What an immeasurable advantage this may be seen from the indifference towards all theory, which is one of the main reasons why the English working class movement crawls along so slowly in spite of the splendid organization of the individual unions, unquote. Lenin goes on to state, in particular, it will be the duty of the leaders to gain an ever clearer insight into all theoretical questions and constantly to keep in mind that socialism, since it has become a science, demands that it be pursued as a science, that is, that it be studied, unquote. Again, Lenin also states in the pamphlet, quote, entitled The Three Sources and Three Component Parts of Marxism, unquote, quote, the philosophy of Marxism is materialism. Marx and Engels defended philosophical materialism in the most determined manner and repeatedly explained how profoundly erroneous is every deviation from this basis. Their views are most clearly and fully expounded in the works of Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach, and Anti-Düring, which, like the Communist Manifesto, are handbooks for every class-conscious worker. That quote ended. That's a very interesting quote. How many of you who claim to be Leninists have read, in addition to the Communist Manifesto, but you have not read Ludwig Feuerbach, or even more importantly, Anti-Düring, or Lenin's follow-up to Anti-Düring, which is entitled, his theoretical work, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. How many of you have read it? He states that it is the handbook, these are the handbooks for every class-conscious worker. Have you made, if you have read it, have you made them, the workers around you, know about these books? Let me interject here that my book was based on both Engels' Anti-Düring and Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism. In that quote from Lenin, Lenin states that these are the basic handbooks for every class-conscious worker, not just the leaders. Can you call yourselves Leninists? You have never studied and restudied these basic seminal works of Marxism. It is not enough to be activists. Listen to what Lenin said. That's a minimal requirement that every communist must do in the struggle against capitalist rule. But if we focus solely on activism, we cannot call ourselves communists. We must approach the struggle as scientists and must do our utmost to impart to our class that same theoretical knowledge that we have acquired. To fear theoretical debate and theoretical controversy is to fear the struggle itself. The brain must lead the body. Activism alone can only win the heart. But theory is what can win the mind of the class-conscious worker. Without the brain, the heart is lost. What few communists understand is that anti-Düring was written by Engels as an attack on a leading member of his own party. And Engels, as a result, came under furious attack from within his own party because of it. What few communists realize is that materialism and imperial criticism was written by Lenin as an attack on members of his own Bolshevik organization. Apparently, as I understand it, Stalin referred to that theoretical debate begun by Lenin as a tempest in a teapot. Such was Stalin's contempt for theoretical battle. If Engels and Lenin's most important theoretical works were polemics directed against members of their own political organization, does not this show that they actively encouraged debate within their organization and debate within the class itself? Because they did not limit those books to be only read by the members of their organization, but by the activists of their class. Internal controversy and debate within a party is healthy and necessary for the education of its members and of our class. If Engels and Lenin were capable of initiating a public polemic against members of their own party, then what is the message they are sending to us? That message is discussion and debate is a requirement for a healthy communist party, and that discussion and debate should not be limited to internal processes within that party. That incredibly important discussion and debate is part of the necessary ideological training for all our class-conscious workers all around the world. If we do not fight for our ideas, how dare we call ourselves revolutionaries, let alone communists? I appeal to every communist revolutionary, whether you call yourself Trotsky or Stalinist or Maoist or just simply Leninist, to get rid of every vestige of sectarianism and start all over in the absolute necessary movement towards a united Leninist worldwide movement, a new international as well. Do not fear debate. Do not fear unity with those who don't 100% agree with you. Do not waste this opportunity of the transition from one revolutionary period to another. We have a world to win. Power to the people.